My name is Carla Benway, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Youth Advocate Programs. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's virtual event, the first in a series called Conversations on the Road to Unlocked. These events will culminate in an in-person conference scheduled for next April in Philadelphia. Today, we have over 300 people registered from across the United States and representing different sectors. And yet we all share a common interest in promoting community safety and youth well-being. Today's event will begin with a brief introduction from our co-hosts and the leaders of the two organizations that have partnered in this effort, Jeff Fleischer, the CEO of Youth Advocate Programs, and Darlene Bailey, the founder and director of the Social Justice Initiative at Bryn Mawr College. They will be followed by introductions to and presentations from each of our speakers, who will be sharing their experience and expertise before we open it up to questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question to a specific presenter or in general, please use the Q&A icon that should be visible to you from within the Zoom platform. If you can't see it, you just need to kind of move your mouse over your screen and it should pop up at the bottom or at the top of your screen, depending on the device that you're on. You can also review questions that are coming in through the Q&A and like those that resonate with you to help push them up the queue. Also, we're all joining from Zoom, but many of us are also joining from our homes or offices where there may be pets or people, and we understand that and ask you to just show some grace to our speakers if we have any interruptions or any internet issues. We're thankful for your participation, and we are really looking forward to an engaging discussion this afternoon. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and mentor, Jeff Fleischer.
Thanks, Carla, and good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I'm Jeff. I'm the CEO of the Youth Advocate Programs and the chair of the board of the National Human Service Assembly. Since 1975, my organization has partnered with communities and government agencies to develop non-residential alternatives to youth incarceration. Today, we begin our series of webinars on what a community-based system of care can look like that replaces and downsizes detention, probation, youth prisons, parole, and policing. We have an opportunity in our time to take action and to finally do something about the juvenile justice system. Over my 45-year career working in juvenile justice, I've seen the failures of a system that relies so heavily on placing kids behind bars and has invested so sparingly in family-focused, community-based programs. I've had the privilege of meeting 1,000 youth who have been imprisoned, and I always come to the same conclusion. This young person could have benefited so much from a community program. Why did we incarcerate them? And at such a great cost, only to be released back to the community with little support, and then all too often, they're incarcerated again for a technical violation, not committing a new crime. Sadly, in too many communities of color and rural low-income communities, the best funded public programs are prisons and detention centers. Many state juvenile justice systems spend 10 times more money on secure facilities than they do on community-based programs. The system was built this way, but now is our time to change it. The average state cost for the secure confinement of a young person is now $588 a day, or $214,000 a year, and that's a 44% increase from 2014. Imagine how you can work to turn a kid around in the community if you had even a small portion of these funds for each kid and family. Imagine how much you can do for the family and to change neighborhood conditions. A study from a few years ago noted that 851 blocks in Chicago spent $1 million on prison sentences per block. Imagine if those dollars were spent on a community system of care as opposed to sending young people away to cages. And even as we see some good work across the country and much progress in reducing the number of young people incarcerated, detention centers and jails still disproportionately incarcerated kids of color and LGBTQ kids. So that leaves us with the question for today: what works? When properly supported and resourced, families and communities do best by kids, especially kids with the most complex needs. The best juvenile justice continuum of care I've ever seen was in Tarrant County, Texas, Fort Worth. The Bloods, Crips, and Latin Kings were all warring, and young people were dying each week due to shootings. Commitments to the state youth prison were off the charts, and the detention center was often overcrowded. While other counties we're responding to the violence by building larger detention centers throughout Texas. The chief probation officer in Fort Worth developed a full continuum of care in the community as an alternative to his detention center and the state youth prison system. The continuum included family preservation, an alternative school, substance abuse treatment, subsidized employment, community service, restorative justice programs, a program from young people charged with sexual offenses, outreach programs, evening recreation, and an intensive gang intervention program hiring credible messengers from the community. He placed the gang intervention program in the neighborhood that had the highest crime rate and sent the most kids to state prison, hiring all staff from the neighborhood, and after the first year of operation, they reduced countywide commitments to the state youth prison by 44%, and the detention center stayed well below capacity. So what does support look like that gets us the outcomes we seek for our young people and their families? Programs that succeed with the highest need and highest risk population are mostly guided by several unique service delivery principles. Maintaining a no-refuse intake policy so that youth are not excluded from services because of their behavior or resistance, or because parents don't participate, or because they are substance abusers. It means individualizing services for each young person, focusing on their families, their strengths, and tailoring services to unique needs and situation. It means intentionally recruiting staff from the communities where the young people live and prioritizing their ability to authentically engage with young people and their families through shared lived experiences and prioritizing cultural, linguistic competency, and humility. It means building skills, competency, and preparing youth for future jobs, creating a sense that they belong here, and fostering a culture of unconditional caring. What does proper resourcing mean? Simple. Divesting in what's harmful and not working, and investing in what is safer, produces better outcomes, has better evidence, and costs less money. Our goal over the next 7 months is to show what the work looks like, what should replace or reduce our reliance on traditional systems that warehouse young people and produce poor recidivism rates, fail to achieve wellness, and are rife with racial bias. A community-based system of care that is guided by these principles may look like the graphic we had on before, if we can go back to that. A community continuum are an array of services that are designed and coordinated specifically to serve the youth and their families with the most complex needs. It includes services and supports on the left that most kids need ordinarily, to services on the right that are very individualized and intensive and designed for youth that have been adjudicated, committed serious crimes. Today, we're going to focus on alternatives to policing and going upstream to address systemic issues. With that, I'd like to hand this over to my colleague and partner in developing this series of virtual panels, Dean Darlene Bailey of the Bryn Mawr College School of Social Work Social Justice Initiative. Darlene?
Thanks so much, Jeff. And many thanks again for reaching out to me and our Social Justice Initiative to co-create and co-host these virtual panels. Hi, everyone. As Jeff said, I'm Darlene Bailey. I'm a professor and the Dean Emeritus of our Graduate School of Social Work and Social Research here at Bryn Mawr College. And I am also the founder of this now 3-year-old organization, lovingly called the SJI, here in Pennsylvania at our Bryn Mawr College. I'm so fortunate to be working with an advisory council of folks whose minds are as sharp as their hearts are wide. As these friends, joined by Kadria Mayer, my graduate assistant from our graduate school, and our SJI network of now over 300 individuals and partnering organizations, and most probably everyone here today knows, there will always be many and likely different paths that woke folks will have about the paths to get to any one place. Many and many different kinds of ideas and different paths that people will come up with. Yet, as long as we hold steadfast to whatever is the agreed upon goal as our ultimate destination, taking time to first understand those different perspectives actually helps to ensure that our shared goal will be met. As Jeff said, our goal for our 3 virtual panels are 3 critical stops that we see on the road to being unlocked. The title of our national conference that was postponed until April 2021 is about discovering what it takes to build a just continuum of care, using these guiding principles that Jeff shared with you, and other principles that you may even come up with as a result of spending your time in conversation with all of us today. And for that, we need to be woke. Indeed, these sessions are for everyone committing to stay wide awake, to effectively and justly act, to change our understanding and our practices, to finally readdress youth crime and reinvest in our families and communities. Such change must be transformational in nature. In other words, it must be a system-wide overhaul, and not only within the realm of juvenile justice professionals, as they obviously cannot do this alone. Those bringing this change must bring into being people that aren't faint of heart, ending our nation's reliance on militarized policing and replacing incarceration, and reviewing to change the current practices that are in place of probation and parole require boldly reimagining and appropriately resourcing new empowered communities. All sectors of all of our communities must step up, think anew, and participate in this transformational change. Our approach must cross and connect traditional boundaries. It must go beyond our police and even beyond members of our current juvenile system. Our approach on this road to being unlocked has to be broader than arrest, surveillance, incarceration, and then more surveillance. It must be of the type that our Congressman John Lewis would deem good trouble. That is, community-based, getting in the way and disrupting the status quo. Our movement must be community-based. It must enlist the skills, the knowledge, the talents of our already existing guardians of safety, including social workers and public health workers, and our schools, our programs, even our state and national associations. It must include our faith leaders and their places of worship, our school teachers and after-school programs, our neighborhood storekeepers and other employers, and other kindred sojourners, and yes, our youth and their families themselves. With them all, the supply of social justice warriors becomes greater than we have traditionally enlisted, and together we can begin to meet the demand. Lives depend on this unity, and most especially, though not exclusively, these are Black and brown lives that must matter. To reach our final destination, this collective work has to, as Jeff said, go upstream to address the root causes of crime in each of our communities, the multiple unjust practices and policies in education, starting with pre-K, and the disparities that also continue to exist in healthcare, employment, and family supports, to just name a few of the areas where the centuries-long existing macro viruses of inequalities and inequities remain devastating. We have to rebuild all of the systems that continuously generate fear and divisions and join forces to authentically support our highest need and our highest risk youth and their families. And lastly, our focus it has to go beyond youth committing nonviolent crimes. We must develop new approaches to support all of our youth, including those involved in serious crimes. Yes, to get to our shared destination of really being unlocked, we must be courageous and compassionate enough to risk sharing our ideas while listening to the ideas of others. We must be self and other forgiving and humble enough to learn, to unlearn, and learn anew. And then, using our heads and our hearts, we must act. Today's conversation starts our journey together. I'm now thrilled to turn this over to our guide, our moderator for our time together, Carmen Darty, the Policy Director of Youth First Initiative. In that capacity, Carmen, who is by profession a lawyer, handles a lot, including reviewing legislation and proposed budgets and developing policy options and generating state and national reports about youth incarceration. Yes, Carmen, excuse me, I got Carla's name in front of me. Carmen, you handle a lot, and I only gave a little synopsis of this. Now, from only just knowing just that much about her, You can already see why Carmen is the perfect person to officially introduce our incredible panelists and facilitate our conversation today. We are grateful. Welcome, Carmen, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the introduction. I just want to center us in the work, and what we do at Youth First is recognize that youth justice is a racial justice issue, and just keeping that in our hearts and minds as we have this conversation. And I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker is Dr. Reverend Starsky Wilson, who is the president and CEO of Deaconess Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri. In 2014, the governor of Missouri appointed Reverend Wilson to co-chair the Ferguson Commission to study the underlying conditions that impede progress, equality, and safety, and make policy recommendations following the horrific police shooting of Michael Brown Jr. Next, we have Shadow Tarver, who is the Associate Director of Community Safety at Save Our Streets in Crown Heights and Bedford-Stuy, Brooklyn, New York. SOS works to prevent gun violence in neighborhoods by mediating conflicts that may end in gun violence and acting as peer counselors to the people who are at risk of perpetrating or being victimized by violence. It is New York City's first and longest standing cure violence site. And last and certainly not least, our most critical voice today is 17-year-old Chavante Trey, who received intensive community-based mentoring and wraparound services from youth advocate programs, which, as we all know, is an alternative to youth incarceration. So with that, I will turn it over to Reverend Starsky to get us started.
Thanks, Carmen, both for the big load of work you do, as aforementioned, and for the gracious opportunity to share here in your introduction. I want to thank Jeff and Darlene for their remarkable work as well in guiding us to this conversation, inviting us all to be in the same space. As noted, I do work here in St. Louis in the wider metropolitan community. There is this small, very small community called Ferguson that came in 2014 to represent a host of issues, quite frankly, around youth justice, child well-being, incarceration, municipal courts, and policing to many of us. And by way of that traumatic event for our entire community, but more than anything else, that traumatic event in the loss of Mike for Leslie McSpadden and for Michael Brown Sr., I came to be in different rooms and conversations. I say this a lot because I recognize that I was the same guy on August 8th, 2014 that I was on August 10th, 2014. But on August 9th, when an 18-year-old young Black boy who had just finished high school and was headed into technical school lie on the ground at the hands of police for 4.5 hours, my life changed. So did the lives of so many who saw him in that space. And so did the lives of all of those who paused long enough to hear the voices of the young people who would turn our attentions to the realities of others like them, living in small hamlets like that, in exurbs, suburbs, and inner cities across the United States of America. And I like to repeat that today in 2020, because it is a helpful reset of the clock, that we are now not a couple of months, but rather we are 6 years into a new movement, as that was the first sustained mass mobilization of the movement for Black lives here and in this community, that we are now 6 years into a movement that has transformed our thinking around justice systems, around what is possible, around community imagination, and what constitutes the criminal legal system, and even our rhetoric around it, by affirming that in so many ways it is unjust. And I only come to be in these conversations because of powerful young people like those who gathered around Mike, and because of the losses of young people who were not cared for like Michael Brown. And so I honor him as I come into this conversation. And I do that also by way of connecting to what I'll share. My work here in St. Louis in philanthropic kind of child advocacy and the work that I came to do in the Ferguson Commission was not because, quite frankly, the governor so honored the philanthropic work for children. It was not because he so felt that the work that I had previously done around youth violence prevention, developing the first plan for the city and the county and East St. Louis together to address what we saw as spikes in youth violence in our communities related to guns. It was rather because he needed somebody with the credibility of being directly engaged in protests in the streets, but who he was also somewhat comfortable with because they touched these institutions. I say that because the commission process that we had to steward over the course of time between the fall of 2014 and 2015, in order to deliver on the objective to make policy recommendations to make our community more fair, more just, and more equal for young people like Michael Brown, had to take a tent not to just take what was coming out of the annals of the academy or that we knew from public policy circles, but we had to take an organizing approach to increase awareness, to engage people in the policy discussion, and to hear from those who were deeply affected, like Trey and others, what they thought and what they knew needed to be done. And so I say that in this moment because what we realized was that what began as a racial equity conversation or as a criminal legal system conversation quickly expanded to be a conversation about putting youth in the center of all public policy dialogue. And that final report that we delivered to the governor and the community there in September 2015 had a full section with recommendations on youth justice, child well-being, and education that came to be lived out and carried in our community later by organizers, advocates who advanced policy recommendations on an ongoing basis. And so where we came was to the intersection of youth justice and youth at the center of policy conversations and the broken system of municipal courts, policing that targeted and focused on Black, brown, and poor young people in order to advance and to support a system of governmental fragmentation. What do I mean? I mean, literally, people were being stopped. Young people like Michael Brown were being stopped on the street for pedestrian stops, which increased their contact with police. There was something called not a warrant, but a wanted list that allowed police to stop these young people and increase their contact with them, and ultimately draw them into a system where fines and fees led them to be under detention and in jail. And the cities would not exist if it were not for the fines and fees. Now, I lay all of that out to say that when we talk about systems that are targeted to young people, we must also note that these systems exist off extraction that is pointed to these young people, and then think about how we reorient around the systems, not just within them, in order to make them more safe. And so I'll tell you what we came up with, and I'm done. Ultimately, we knew that we needed alternatives not only to policing in our community, but we needed alternatives to sentencings coming out of the municipal courts, which were being used in the first place. And so community members suggested to us that we needed alternatives to community service, community engagement from the courts, in order to not engage in the process of extraction from people who are already poor, from young people who did not have resources, that ended up having them being detained. Ultimately, what we knew was the system of incarceration and detention was creating for us prisons in the interest of poverty. And this disproportionately impacted Black and brown young people. We also knew that we had to look beyond the criminal justice system. We had to look into the broader community. And so we noted things like universal access to early childhood, which has long-term benefits for economic development, but also long-term benefits for opportunities for young people, had to be on the source of the continuum of community safety and well-being as well. And we knew that the realities going on in schools, where SROs, or school resource officers, entered into an environment for education, actually were out of place, and we needed mobilization to make sure that police and the implementation of prisons were not actually in schools, such that they began to socialize our young people for detention as well. And so we're pleased that coming out of that work, those kinds of calls to action were carried by community organizations, networks of faith communities like our local Gamaliel affiliate, Metropolitan Congregations United, who led a Break the Pipeline campaign to directly engage police chiefs, the courts, detention centers, and is now continuing to participate in participatory defense education in order to keep the community engaged with systems to keep young people in community and out of detention. The Coalition Against Police Crimes and Repression and the Organization for Black Struggle, who engaged in a multi-year campaign on reimagining public safety, which ultimately led to bringing Cure Violence into our community and having a community oversight and steering committee for it, by first challenging the idea that the only way to reduce crime is to invest in more police. And finally, campaigns like the Close the Workhouse campaign, which recently succeeded in closing a medium security jail, led by young people active in the movement for Black Lives, as an expression of their commitment to divest from policing in prisons and invest in community safety, saving $16 million a year from our city's budget, where only 4% is invested in the type of continuum that Jeff has talked about before, and more than 67% is invested in old definitions of public safety. This is an expression locally of what it means when young people call for the defunding of police. This is a real policy discussion that only happens with mobilization in community of community to do the cultural organizing, the awareness building, and the narrative change work that is required for us to build the will to make this all work for all of our young people. I'm excited to be a part of the discussion and really excited to hear from Shadow and Trey as well.
Thank you, Reverend. You've brought up so many different topics that I hope we can get into around the Q&A. So with that, I'll turn it over to Shadow.
Thank you so much, Carmen, and Reverend Starsky, thank you so much for that stirring conversation. So many important things that you mentioned, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing in St. Louis that honestly has become a model, like you said, for the past 6 years for what mass mobilization looks like across the different states, especially now with the Black Lives Matter movement. So thank you so much for your work and your dedication. Really appreciate that. I'm really excited and looking forward to also hearing from Trey more than I am from myself or anyone else, because I believe exactly what you said, Reverend Starsky, in talking about both the policy issues, but also what's actually happening in our communities and in our neighborhoods. It's very much youth-led, and it's very much coming from the energy and the agitation and the aggravation that kind of currently lives within the youth community. And they have so much power and potential to do so many great things. And I know a part of it is us as elders thinking that we can guide them, but a lot of times they already have the kind of both moral compass and brains about themselves to be able to take on this work. And so I'm so glad to be here today. Thank you to everyone who helped organize, especially in the tenets of talking about how we center youth work and how we center youth capacity, because I do think it's one of the most important tenets of any organization that's trying to do national work right now. I will say that even when I think into the past and when I think about, the civil rights movement, right, that was also led by youth, right? A lot of people, of course, we know our great legends and our great pillars, such as Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but Stokely Carmichael, right? SNCC, that was doing all of the wonderful work down in the South and doing the freedom rides. And so a lot of this, again, has to be centered on youth focus. I want to preface this by saying I apologize first and foremost if you hear anything in the background or if you see me all of a sudden moving to my left or right. I am at work right now. Our organization is still running full speed throughout the COVID crisis in New York City because there are still so many needs. And if anything, COVID didn't erase any of the realities, it just exacerbated them. especially for people of color in the communities that we live in, especially for people who are falling below poverty lines, people who never had good access to education, career opportunities, or even to a right shake in the criminal justice system. And so today we have a couple of events going on where we're actually giving out personal protective equipment and groceries to folks. And so I'm trying to do both to direct that at the same time while I'm trying to give you all my full attention. So again, I do apologize if you see me get pulled away, but I'm happy to be here with you all and so grateful to be a part of this. As mentioned, my name is Shadow Tarver. I am the Associate Director of Community Safety for the SOS program, which stands for Save Our Streets Bed-Stuy. That is a part of my overall organization, which is called Neighbors in Action, which has sites both in Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, Brooklyn, two communities that have been long-standing bastions of Black residential life and culture. And this organization has been around for over 20 years. And also this organization is part of another more grand organization known as the Center for Court Innovation, which is a national advocacy, research, and direct action organization that is working towards restorative justice. It was originally founded with tenets around criminal justice, but that obviously has changed, right? Because we want to stop using the language that, of course, tends to create perceptions about who people are. And so we're not going to talk about criminal justice. We're going to talk about restorative justice, which is what justice is supposed to be as well. So I have the great pleasure of directing a team in part of Neighbors in Action into some work around cure violence, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the history of our organization really starts back in the early 90s, and what was known as the Crown Heights riots. And that was an unspeakable, unfortunate incident where a Hasidic Jewish driver ran into a young Black family, a Caribbean Black family in Crown Heights. Unfortunately, it killed one of the children that was part of that family. And then afterwards, there was a riot that broke out between the majority Black community on one side of Crown Heights and the Hasidic Jewish community that was on the other side. During that riot, a Hasidic individual who was on leave from Melbourne as a student was also killed. And so we had two murders within the span of 48 hours that really rocked a community that had sowing tensions because of inequality, because of inequity, because of perceptions about opportunities and actually lived realities for the people who were most affected. Out of that was born our organization to really both address the issues that were going on, but also to heal the community, which was the more important part. And so it was about recognizing the differences between the communities because of the different backgrounds that people had, but also to acknowledge that there wasn't a lot of conversation already happening between the communities. And so Neighbors in Action was originally called the Crown Heights Mediation Center, but now we are called Neighbors in Action to be more all-encompassing, and because we also do work in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. My role in the organization, again, is to oversee our Save Our Streets program, which uses a cure violence global method into intervening in violence, but also, again, healing communities. Cure violence is a national and actually an international model now that started in Chicago by a professor and an epidemiologist who wanted to look at violence not as a criminal issue, but as a public health issue, right? That there are factors and there are things that create the conditions which lead people to violence. And when you think about that as a disease, you can also think about ways to inoculate people, and you can also think about ways to cure that disease. You can also, of course, think about the last part, which is healing that disease for people who have been stricken by it, whether as victims, whether as people who actually have, done some violence to folks. But there has to be a redemptive piece, and there has to be a restorative piece. And so we do all of that through a myriad of ways. One of the biggest, kind of signifiers for us, and one of the things that people most knows most well for is having credible messengers. As Dr. Reverend Starsky had mentioned, these are folks who are from the community, who are of the community, who are known in the community, who are respected by the community. And they are actually the ones on the front lines intervening in violence. And that means, if they find out about something or if they hear about something potentially bubbling up in the neighborhood, they actually go to the individuals who may be involved and they try to help mediate that before something happens, right? So this is preventative work. This is proactive work. We try to tell people that we aren't superheroes, although I believe every single person on my team is a superhero and is a superhuman. They do not walk walk around with guns or with bulletproof vests, but they actually, again, try to prevent people from engaging in gun violence on a daily basis. And I'm so grateful just to be a part of the team and see them work. We have violence interrupters. We also have outreach workers who work directly with both at-risk or what we call high-risk youth individuals in the community. And again, these individuals are at risk of either committing violence or having violence committed to them, right? And we set them up with these outreach workers who work as mentors to both, show them different things, put opportunities in front of them to receive employment, to extend their education opportunities, to do civic engagement and volunteer service and really understand what it means to be part of a community, and just overall build the capacity so they can be a holistic human being and not just a participant in a program. And so, as I mentioned today, we are doing civic engagement and direct service, and this is just a part of an overall program that we run throughout the year for our participants and for people who are engaged in our program. Again, we are community-based, we are community-led. Anyone who is seeking help or who wants to find out more about us can always come in, and our doors are always open. Again, COVID did not stop us. It just forced us to wear masks and use hand sanitizer when we're doing engagements, and obviously social distancing, but the work continues. And the last piece, again, like I wanted to mention before about the healing component, is incredibly important. I don't know if you all heard about this, but last month around July 12th, the biggest shooting, at least in my tenure here, had occurred. And it was after we had 2 years of no gun homicides in our catchment area, which is about a 32 block radius within Bed-Stuy. And that was huge for us. And it was such a mark of pride. A 1-year-old was shot and killed fatally in front of a park as their family was trying to just have a barbecue. And it was crushing on so many different levels. And there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of angst, there was a lot of despair and a lot of hopelessness, right? New York City, like most large cities in this country, suffers from a rise in gun violence during the summertime. And again, to have it during an unprecedented, at least for my generation, period of a health crisis was crushing. And what I really wanted to point out was some of the worst things that came back, again, were victim blaming. It's like, why was a young mother out, at 8 p.m. with her child? It was like, she wanted to be outside. She wanted to enjoy herself. She wanted her child to enjoy that with her. And there's no reason and there's no excuse for anyone to have to walk around with the insecurity of thinking about whether or not they should be in a space that belongs to them, right? A park belongs to the community. And there were tons of calls, again, for an increase in police at the same time that the Black Lives Matter movement is talking about defund the police. And we are very much within the mind that police can never be the end-all be-all and should never be looked upon to be the end-all be-all within any community. They are a component, and they are an important component. I don't think anyone else in the community will be doing investigations. I don't think any other person in the community will be following up on various crimes that have already occurred. And I think that police have a definite place in that work. But when we're talking about defund the police and we're talking about decreasing the militarization, right, and the money that goes into the militarization of the police, we're talking about taking those funds and reestablishing them within the community and redistributing them to the community in various ways. And that is things like better education and better schools, more access to outdoor space, healthier lives for all people. And we do a really big push for an increase in aid and resources for mental health especially. We have actually offer clinician services for participants at our home base. And so as we talk about more things about how we're going to heal communities, we do have to recognize and be aware that there are definitely different types of the body that we are trying to cure as we fight against violence and as we fight against inequity. So again, thank you so much for having me on today, and I really look forward to hearing from you, Trey.
Thank you, Shadow. Everything you said was just perfect. That's how it should be. But yeah, my name is Trevante. I'm from North New York. I'm a kid that had intense care with YAP, and just where I am now is just, I'm glad to be here. And without YAP, I wouldn't be here, honestly. Without that community-based program, I wouldn't be here. I never saw myself as an activist, but I'm proud to have opportunity to advocate for alternatives to youth incarceration. For me, this movement is personal. If it weren't for a community-based alternative to incarceration, my life would have gone completely left. When I was a preteen, my family and I lived in a temporary studio in Lyons. Lyons is a small town in upstate New York with not a lot of Black or biracial kids like me. because of my family struggles and just being a 14-year-old trying to fit in, I did a lot of things that got me in the wrong kind of attention. I joked around, acted out, and got in trouble a lot in school. One time, my friend and I were playing around the school cafeteria, and I playfully tossed ketchup on her backside. That moment almost resulted in me having to spend 2 years behind bars. Fortunately, I had just become a participant in a program called Youth Advocate Programs, better known as YAP. YAP matched me with James Schuler, an advocate who lived in my neighborhood. He's an amazing Black man who became my role model, mentor, and family advocate. He worked with a lawyer to fight for me. He worked with a lawyer to fight for me to stay in the YAP program instead of going to youth prison. As part of his services, he worked with my mom to bring my family back together. We moved in with my grandma and my family. By my family being supported by YAP, I started doing better in school. So with James being there, so James, he has street cred is what you would want to call it. So he knows what goes on in the community and stuff. So he understands where I'm coming from. That's what we need. We need people within the community to be in these community-based programs so that we can relate to them and understand, so they understand where we're coming from. So just James, he's amazing. Yeah, he's amazing. He taught me a lot of things, how to apply for jobs. He taught me things about cars. Well, today my gas tank fell off. He's gonna help me with that. It's bumming, but yeah, he just means a lot. And I forgot which I shouldn't have forgot, but I wanted to give all you guys to thank you for actually being here today. And this is a really big deal. And I think this is really gonna make a change in the world. Today I have a full-time job and I'm going back to school in a few years where I'll finish my senior year. A couple of months ago, I told my story at a Black Lives Matter marching rally in my town. I'm an example of what happens when communities invest in kids instead of throwing them away. I'm an example of what happens when you believe that Black Lives Matter.
Thank you so much, Shadow and Trey. That's great. I wanted to go ahead and start the Q&A. I have a few questions lined up for you all, and I actually want to start with you, Trey, because as we talk about a continuum of care, that seems like such a big term, and all of these other terms keep popping up, what it could mean. And I think what would be helpful for folks to hear from you is what were the services or are the services that YAP is providing you to help people really understand what it is?
Okay, so for me, and probably for a lot of other kids around different towns or cities or whatever, it's just that it may be just one thing that they need for that kid to change their whole life around. Food in the refrigerator or something. You know what I'm saying? Maybe needing help, buying a bed. I needed that at one point. I needed help, to get a bed because we couldn't afford a bed at the time. They helped me with that, and just pretty much everything, food, even housing. They helped us with housing. Christmas, moms, we were struggling. She couldn't really afford to get us presents. So yeah, they just brought in a whole bunch of presents and just it really changed me as a person too, just seeing how much people care. And I'm sorry, I get a little emotional when I talk about this stuff because it really means a lot to me. So yeah, but they just, everything you need, they provide you with. At least the community-based programs, everything you need is just they provide you with. And it's just that I get really upset when people just take kids and throw them in juvenile detentions or prisons or whatever. Just like me, 2 or 3 years ago, I was a totally different person. So if you actually give them a chance to change, they can change a lot.
Thank you. So was someone chiming in? Sorry. Oh, great. So what I'm hearing, right, is a lot of talk about not even a justice system right now, right? We're talking about basic human needs and healing, the healing work. So I heard it from you, Shadow, heard it from you, Reverend, and Trey. Just how do we convince those policymakers, the pockets, right, to invest in healing work? Because that is what a continuum is at the end of the day, making communities whole, making young people whole, and healing those fractures. So I'll ask you, Reverend, how do we convince the purses and the policymakers to invest in that?
Yeah, I think first we got to kind of find our appropriate lane. I work in the area of philanthropy. One of the things that I think philanthropy does well in America, historically, quite frankly, I don't know that we're doing it very well right now, is invest in things that are not proven. We've unfortunately accepted the language of evidence-based model. I'm glad YAP is an evidence-based model. I'm glad Cure Violence is an evidence-based model. But at some point, it wasn't. At some point, someone had to risk and venture the capital to support something that was a good idea, that was a concept. To be clear, you don't have a civil rights movement without philanthropy that's willing to invest in leadership, in certain leaders, Ella Jo Baker, Martin Luther King, and others, to support what they got. They didn't have any logic models. They didn't have any theories of change. They were close to the issue. They had lived experiences, and they had a belief that they could make a difference. And so I think part of the role of philanthropy is to invest in those kinds of things, and those in and of themselves are healing, right? Investing in people, following and supporting their agency through community organizing is a psychologically and emotionally healing element of this work. The other is, and so I say philanthropy has to organize to invest in these things that the state will not. Recognizing that the state, whether it's federal, state, or local, will still be the largest payer for services. We've got to show and test and invest in making sure that these models are working so that the state can then do their appropriate role in supporting them. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about licensed, clinical social workers. I'm talking about somatics, which is healing modalities that deal with how we use our bodies and energies in order to manage the stressors that come to us, and allowing young people who are closer to that than they are to the challenges of the reimbursement system for licensed clinical social work and or therapy to receive those supports. So I think we've got to prove it in that way. That's a call to my colleagues in philanthropy, a call to us to support healing work in communities. And we've got to do that in order to build up the capacity for these alternatives to systemic, because let's be clear, handing people over to a healthcare system that's broken and it's built upon your whether you work at a certain place also doesn't work. And so we've got to find alternative healing practices in community. We've got to invest in built green space in communities that is also healing, responding to the social determinants of health. So all of these elements speak to healing, and I think philanthropy has a role there. State investment in these things have a role as well to make sure that young people have access to things that heal naturally occurring in community that often we do not.
Thank you. And just as a follow-up to that around investment, as we talk about this moment about defunding the police, and both Shadow and Reverend, you all talked about this a little bit, about defunding and investing in communities. And I'll ask Shadow this first, and then you, Reverend Dr. Wilson, what would be those first investments for young people under the guise of defunding the police?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a number of things, right? And we talk about investments in school and education, and we know that the education is the bedrock for what creates citizens in our society. And so when we're talking about defunding the police in a place like New York City, that means paying teachers what they actually deserve, right? That means that teachers shouldn't have to be guidance counselors, suppliers when they use their money to buy supplies for their school and their classrooms. That means that they shouldn't be working 14-hour days without being compensated for that. And when you have teachers, especially wearing hundreds of different hats, that affects the quality of work that they pass on to the 35 plus students that are in their classrooms, which again is too many students. And so in a place like New York City, which I'm sure models and mirrors a lot of other cities across the United States, that has to be one of them, right? When we're talking about investing in programs, we're talking about things like summer youth. Here in New York City, summer youth was almost canceled entirely because of what's happening with COVID and the fears of a hole in the budget for next year. But there was a clamoring from the community, from city council members, from our local officials, that this was not acceptable. Right. And so that also goes into the piece that Reverend Starsky was touching on, is about holding people accountable, especially at the state, city, local level. Right. And the more that we can try and the more that we have to push on our local officials that we actually elect in, that's part of what civic engagement means. Right. And I think right now, there's a very palpable movement because it's a presidential election year and people are thinking of the presidency as the only thing that, drives the vote. And that can't be the reality anymore. We have to register, especially young people, to vote who don't vote in enough numbers to really make their voices heard. And that also comes in with the education piece, right? We have to put the information in front of them. There was a lot of voter disenfranchisement, a lot of voter suppression that's going on. It's because either a lack of information or because of disinformation that's being distributed. And so we have to do a better job of really supplying the agencies and the organizations that are doing things like registering young people to vote. And we have to give them more money. And that's through the philanthropy piece. And through the accountability piece, again, is that once more people and more folks from the electorate are actually engaged in electing, right, then we will have a more inclusive and a more representative democracy that we have always hoped for. And so I am hopeful that this year in 2020, that it will be one of many years in which there is almost a narrow and singular focus on both spreading enfranchisement and then using that as a platform to then redistribute the resources like better education, like better funding for healthcare, like more youth employment and youth opportunity programs in our cities.
Thank you. And just a follow-up question with that, we talk a lot about accountability for our elected officials. What about accountability in our communities, right? So at the Youth First, we work with several states with campaigns to end the use of youth prisons and invest in alternatives. And sometimes some of our biggest opposition are the not in my backyard people from the communities. So how should folks be thinking about this as we talk about divesting from the prison model and investing right back in these communities and bringing young people back to their communities? And I think, and then that would go into another question about violence, how people perceive violence in their communities. But really, I'm trying to figure out, what are we doing to hold our own communities accountable when we want to bring young people back?
Yeah, I wanted, so both questions together. So I want to note some metrics, some places for people to look to be accountable as relates to the state, right? So it's helpful for us to always remember, Shadow made a great point, we focused on the presidential, is that educational funding is the responsibility of the state boards of education. I live in a state where in the context of COVID, $200 million got taken out of the educational system while schools are being told to open rather than investment. So, I mean, we got to remember that that's a state level function and that policing, courts, have largely close, in circuit courts and others, family courts, they're very close to local, if not totally local functions. And policing is largely seen and overseen at City Hall. So budgets matter for accountability. And so when I think about our budget in the city of St. Louis, it's helpful for me to note that in the time period where we've been increasing investments in policing and seeing increases in violence in community, we have been systematically decreasing the budget for our public health department. We have gotten rid of our chartered, our charter required youth commissioner role until the community last summer said we need this role we've been calling for years. So I say to say, when you want to look at the priorities of your city, your elected governance, look at the budget and see where the trends are for increasing and decreasing financial support, and that is a critical tool. And that becomes important, and I make that functional kind of nerdy case, if you will, because it was important for us when the community organized to get Cure Violence that it went into the public health department, not under public safety, so that it would be treated as a health intervention in the same way the Shadow spoke to it. As we are now working to bring YAP into our community, we are working to build the case to the courts and the detention centers that it actually costs less money to keep young people in community and provide them with wraparound services than it does to keep them in prisons or in some form of detention. So you're actually not making good use of our dollars with your tough on crime rhetoric that locks up our kids. So those things are really important. And I say them to connect to your other question, Carmen, which is about community accountability. I'm a clergy person, so I'll put that hat on. The first people standing behind the police and calling for more police in the Black community tend to be the Black pastors. That's a problem. We are problematic in that regard. And so when we talk about our accountability, first we've got to be accountable to our rhetoric. As Christian clergy, I am called to the ministry of reconciliation. That rubs up against the idea that young people should be held always accountable for the worst thing they've ever done. And my responsibility as a person of faith and what I should be held accountable to is to what my work is to have them to be received again in relationship and community, to be engaged in the work of reconciliation and restoration, and to be providing for them a space of redemption. That's what I think we should be holding faith communities to. That's the posture that we should be in. And we should always then have an allocation of support, of resource around how we will receive and restore young people in partnership with those who are providing those kinds of supports. And so that means that we've got to have a little more knowledge about youth development in community spaces. We have to be engaging. Part of our accountability is engaging and having knowledge around the use of public resources because we provided them through our taxes. And we have to be accountable to listening to the young people first. And I'm very clear about this. Listening to the young people before we listen to the police or the prosecutors. Because our picture of who our own young people are has been unfortunately framed indelibly by our beliefs of the word and the works of police and prosecutors. And I don't think that's a faithful witness to who these children and youth are.
No, and Reverend, if I could just add something to echo those, I certainly agree. And there's so many things that you touched upon that definitely hit home. And the main being, when we're talking about accountability and how we do this from a community perspective, right, is that it has to start with community. Again, it has to start with youth, but it also has to start with the elders in the community, has to start with the clergy, which we have a huge engagement and a great relationship with when we do our work, because when we're talking about those redemptive practices and we're talking about doing healing, for a lot of people it is through faith, right? And we recognize that, and especially within a Black community like Bed-Stuy, that is what people look to and that is what people look for when they're looking for healing. But I have been doing a lot of work with a mutual aid group in Bed-Stuy known as Bed-Stuy Strong, which is a community-oriented, community-led, community-working collective of people who are not joined together by an organization that has a 501c3, right? We don't have resources. We have collected donations from both inside and out the community, because what we've recognized, again, is that we can't always rely on the outside forces, and that there isn't some indelible superhero who's going to come in and swoop in and save everyone, that we have to do the work ourselves. A lot of times when we're talking about accountability, especially in communities of color, it's used actually as a way to criminalize the things that people of color are doing. It's used as a way, again, to really create a source of victimization, but also a criminalization, as I mentioned before. And what I don't want to happen is that people feel that we need to be saved or that we can't do it ourselves. And so it's about empowering the members of the community to do it themselves in the way that they know how. I have a lot of different political views, but one of the ones that I really like from my days when I was in college and studying was Marxism. And there's not every single tenet that I agree with, but the one tenet that I do love is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And that is really what community should be built upon, and that's really what should happen. And while we won't be out here waving our fingers and telling people what they should be doing, what we're doing is actually inviting folks to say, you have something to contribute. Like, you aren't a person, you may not have a lot of money, you may not have food, in your house right now, but if we can give you that, we also know that you have the capacity and the capability to do something for the community as well. And so the more that we can provide those options for folks, and the more that we can show them that there are different ways that they can contribute, the more we'll have that community accountability piece.
Right. And Trey, I wanted to ask you a question. Outside of YAP, are you feeling supported in your community right now?
Am I feeling supported in my community?
And if not, what are those things you would need to feel supported and safe in your community?
Can you reword that a little bit?
Yeah. Do you feel like the members of your community support you?
What members?
Anybody. Is there a church or school? Do you feel supported by that at all?
School is there's just all different kinds of teachers in the school. So some teachers I feel supported by, but some obviously not. But yeah, actually a lot of people in the community, now that they seem like YAP has done to me, which I don't know if they actually know that YAP really like helped me a lot, which they need to know that like YAP, this community-based program really works. Like it changed me a lot. So it's like a 50-50 with do I feel like supported by my community is like a 50-50.
Okay, that's helpful. I have one last question, then I have a bunch of questions from the audience. How do we center addressing racial disparities as we look to the continuum of care, right? My fear is always that we could increase those as we're over programming youth, obviously more brown and Black youth. How are we keeping that in our minds as we think about a continuum of care? And I'll ask Reverend Starsky to start us off.
Yeah, I think you know, some basic things. We've got to be able to, we got to be intentional about disaggregating data along the lines of race when we are developing programming. We've got to focus our interventions considering cultural approaches that meet the young people with the deepest need. And we've got to assure that the people who are guiding, not just implementing with the direct touch, but are guiding the disbursement of resources and the allocation of resources around these programming within the systems reflect or have some sense of the lived experiences of the young people that they are seeking to impact. So I think all of those things are critical. Then finally, I'll say, go back to Jeff's example from Tarrant County. I'm from Dallas County originally, just next door. We've got to resource the performance and professional development of the actors within these systems. And I say that because when we came to talk about YAP in our community with the representatives of the family courts and the detention centers, they remembered going to visit Fort Worth, Texas, and learning about the interventions there. And they brought back lessons even from YAP, even though they didn't bring back the full-blown program. And so they began to use things they learned to reduce the population of young people in detention based upon a visit. So as budgets contract for state agencies across the country, learning opportunities for the people who administer these programs will likely reduce as well. And I'm saying we've got to resource that kind of learning exchange, not look down upon it within either our social service organizations or in our public sector entities, because this is where people are going to get the information to learn to do the work in ways that are sensitive to the cultures and context in which they work.
Yeah, and I just like to piggyback off of that. It is about the resources and it's the power of the purse. But I would think more so when we're talking about accountability, especially for elected officials and the folks who will be controlling the purse in states and cities, who will be directing these resources based on the policies that they feel are representative of their districts and of the people who voted them in. I would also like to say, I would just hope that it's not performative actions. And it's not just because it looks good on the camera. And I think when we're talking about, especially with this movement that is happening and taking the nation by storm, a lot of folks are afraid, right, that the energy might dissipate at some point. And again, that the folks who claim that they were going to make direct actions and do direct service for organizations and for people of color, that they're just going to forget about it, right? That it's going to be lost to the collective consciousness, to the next new thing or the next thing that, takes over our minds and our time and our efforts. And so as long as we can, again, hold the people accountable to make sure that actions, again, just aren't performative and that they're actual, I think we'll have, better outcomes, and we'll also do a better job at centering, again, for people of color and for Black people especially.
Great. So I'm going to move on to some of the questions that you all had in the audience. First was just a point of clarification from you, Shadow. It was asked, is the Healing Communities curriculum called Cure Violence? Okay, great. A few questions came in about gun violence in our communities and what can be done about that. And I'll start with you, Shadow.
Yeah, absolutely. And so again, the cure violence approach is again about using credible messengers and respected individuals from the community to go out and potentially intervene in violence before it happens. It's a preventative approach. It's supposed to reach, again, the most at-risk individuals in our community. But it's also about providing, again, more resources and opportunities. And so there's an education component, there's an employment component, there is, again, a clinical component where we actually have social workers and trained clinicians and therapists who work with individuals on individual plans and make sure that there's goals that they want to reach in their own lives. Because a lot of it is folks being mired within their own emotions and not recognizing that there are paths for them that they can create and that they can chart. But again, Cure Violence, Incredible Messengers are also just one, finger on the hand that needs to really go against violence in our communities. We'll sound like a broken record when we talk about the inequities, and everything that leads to violence comes from that, right? It comes from disinvestment in Black communities and communities of color around the country. And by disinvestment, I mean that it was intentional, right? And there were resources that were being pulled out and not resources being pushed in at the same time. So the more that we can fight those forces that have created the conditions, the more we can have an equitable and just society with our laws and with the way that we criminalize specific things and not other things. Those are the ways that we're going to combat violence together. And we're just going to be one component in that.
Would anyone else like to comment on what can be done about the abundance of guns in our communities?
Yeah, I just want to jump into, I actually want to do what you just did. Let us be clear. A precondition for gun violence in communities is guns in communities. So we also have to recognize that a lot of what we're talking about doing with interventions with young people on the ground almost seeds the case or gives up the ground that we assume that there are going to be guns in our community. So we do have to go upstream. We do have to wrestle with gun laws in our states. This is largely a state level issue. We have fought this. We've fought for stronger gun laws in the city of St. Louis. We've had the state legislature to tell us that we can't have stronger gun laws in the city than we have at the county, than we have at the state level. We have passed laws by a ballot initiative at our state level to reduce access to guns. Legislature comes in a year to repeal the will of the people. And so we've got to have bold action. Shout out, snaps, and appreciation to the Attorney General in New York for taking bold action related to the largest gun lobby in the country. But we have to recognize that we will continue to have these issues of access to guns as long as we decide we're only going to intervene. I like that idea of a finger on the hand. Yes, we need to intervene where it's closest to young people, but we also have to build a continued will to keep pressure to constrain the free access to guns in our communities, in our states, and across the country.
Great. A new question, is anyone working or interested in collaborating to achieve equity and funding for public defender salaries, budgets, and caseloads? I know we've talked some about prosecutors and municipal courts, but obviously on that other side, defending our young people are the public defenders, the majority of which are defending our young people. Do we know folks who are doing that equity work for representation?
I unfortunately do not, but I look forward to, my hope is that it's happening, so I want to make sure I find out about it.
Right.
Yeah, my parent organization, the Center for Court Innovation, again, is a restorative justice agency that works actually as a part of the New York State court system. And they've put out numerous literature around the fact that courts across the land are actually losing a lot of money. And people forget a lot about that third branch of government, right, as a national focus, but also as a state and local focus. And the truth is that a lot of courts are being underfunded. The only advocates typically that they have for them are judges themselves. And most of the times, if you don't know enough about your local judge, or if your judge position is not elected and it's appointed, people know less and less, and it's incredibly non-transparent for a lot of folks throughout the country. And so I think that there obviously needs to be more research done and more research published specifically towards that end, to give people more information about what their local court system comprises of, what the powers are, and also how it works and how it affects their lives. And so when we're talking about raising the salaries of public defenders, right? That again is another state level type of directive that again is only being advocated by the people who actually work in courts. And I think that if we can talk more and develop more advocacy programs and talk to more organizations to put that in their agenda, the more both notoriety you'll receive for that effort, and the more that it will actually make an impact. I will say also that bail funds have become a really huge kind of community outpouring way that the criminal justice system now is also being affected in a positive direction. And that again came from a grassroots-led effort to understand that people shouldn't go to jail, or people shouldn't be waiting in jail for, you know, small crimes, petty crimes. Sometimes, you know, in the case of Kalief Browder, for something that they didn't even commit, right? And that's because our public system of courts is not adequately funded. And so there's a lot of work to do. And I would, you know, encourage folks to go look at some of the literature from CCI and other organizations that are doing this nationally.
We've got a few questions for you, Trey, about what's next for you.
All right, so hopefully after school, I would like to go to college to I would like to go for like nursing school to be a heart surgeon. I want to be in the medical field. But before that, I want to like play football, which is like, you know, obviously it's really hard to get into the league and all that, but anything I got to do, I'm going to be willing to do it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, let me ask you a follow-up, Trey. How has COVID affected you so far? I mean, I know we don't know when it will end, but how has it affected what you want to do?
So COVID, being in school was kind of like motivation for me for football, and just school in general, like college, to go on to be a doctor or whatever. Just being there, getting good grades, it feels good to just get good grades and stay on top of everything. And then just like sometimes the one-on-one helps a lot. So like whatever this is, or this is gonna be online, this hybrid is, I don't really think it's like, I mean, it's necessary, but not at the same time, because it's just that one-on-one helps a lot. And yeah.
Yeah, I think you're not alone in that, right? We talk to students and young people all over the country who are involved in our work and our campaigns. And it's tough, right? Like a lot of people depended on school for many things, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not getting it, but.
And if you're at home and you're online, like just like reading something online, trying to like, if you don't get it, how do you get it? Sometimes you need someone to show you either a different way or explain in a deep detail in order for you to get it.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the people that get paid, like teachers, to do their job, they need to be able to do that. And if so, they got to do it through video, then they have to do it.
Yeah. So switching the conversation a little bit to COVID, it goes into some of your questions about stakeholders and policymakers not seeing this as a priority. As we move into a new budget for states, they will see shortfalls. And oftentimes the first things that'll get cut are the things we're talking about. So how do we get buy-in from stakeholders now to keep these sort of services in our communities and to our young people and families, and knowing that these budget crises are beginning? And I'll start with you, Dr. Wilson.
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things is we all need to be engaged in a broader container for civic engagement. So what do I mean by that? I just think we have to be, as citizens broadly, residents in the United States and in our local communities, we've got to be engaged, whether it's our church, neighborhood association, a community organizing group explicitly, or advocacy group. We have to be within some committed community where our hearts are, where we have passions, to keep us informed and connected to the wider work that's happening in our communities and by public entities. So that's number one. We need a membership card somewhere to help us to be about that work and to keep us accountable in that work. And those entities, I think, are best positioned to be in dialogue with our cities, with our school districts, with our county level folks who are making decisions about funding. And I want to say two things. Number one, we got to make sure that we're paying attention to the regular budgets and how they're being affected. Number two, we have to be paying attention to how CARES Act funding that is coming down from the federal government to states, and in some cases, if your county or your municipality are large enough, coming directly to them, and how those funds are being allocated. I think more than anything else, because we know that poverty is tied up in these things, we have to be asking questions about how much is being allocated for housing supports. We have to be making sure that where possible on the local level, we are extending things like housing moratoriums, because these are the things that we talk about with youth violence, or the things that trip young people into these systems are crimes, in many cases of desperation. And so when we start talking about people being unhoused or being dislodged from stability in a house, then we're going to have increases in these challenges. So I think in the context of COVID, we've seen our grant making shift to focus more on our family economic stability work. And I think we need to be calling on local officials to make sure they keep investments in human services and family stability, in housing supports, keeping housing moratoria in place where necessary and where possible, in order to make sure that we've got the resources allocated. And again, that's going to be in the regular state budget, regular city budget, regular school district budget, and also in those special CARES Act funding elements that are coming from the federal government.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that again, the general election is November 3rd, and there are tons of elections that are happening both on the state, national, local level, right? And so if you're talking about specific policies that you want to see implemented or specific budget items that you want to see prioritized, that's the candidates that you're going to put into office to do those things. And so you need to take a really good look at your local ballot. And there are tons of resources that are available online for that, to be able to do that and actually give you really credible ways of finding out information about the candidates. But something that almost every single person on this line, if you're 18 years old, if you are a citizen, if you are eligible to vote, the thing you can do is vote. And then when you vote, that is you holding your elected representative accountable in one way. It's not the only way, but that is why I think it's so important to spread the message about the franchise right now, and to ensure that folks do have access to the polls when it comes around for November 3rd.
Yeah, if you allow me one quick moment of redemption, I have to say in the context of COVID too, if you've not already been advocating to say it broadly, let them all out. What am I saying? Young people in detention, young people in youth prisons who have any opportunity, if you believe it, for rehabilitation, should be allowed to be let out now. So when we start talking about that, there are greater exposure in these youth prisons and detention centers than they are if we place them into community with support. So if there's ever a time to be advocating and to be pushing, quite frankly, that time is either past or it's absolutely right now to release young people from youth prisons.
Great, thank you. And I echo that 100%. A few more questions before I turn it over again. I'm going back a little bit deeper at specific community-based programs. We've had a few questions about what community-based alternatives to incarceration do we know of any that are geared towards LGBTQ youth, specifically Black and Brown LGBTQ youth? And the question says, we know that this is a huge population in our JJ systems that's overrepresented. So this person's curious about any community-based organizations that work specifically for them and wherever.
I'll jump. I was trying to fall back a little bit, but I'll say one of the things I'll say here is not always named in the same way, but I'll lift the name of Covenant House across the country because a lot of these things are intersecting, right? We're talking about why are young people unhoused? Why do people find themselves in contact with systems? Covenant House is broadly seen as support to young people who are unhoused. They provide life skills training and transitional supports, but the reality is one of the number one reasons why young people end up unhoused is because of family strife, and often that is related to their understanding of sexual identity and orientation. And so a high percentage of LGBTQIA youth find themselves unhoused, receiving supports and life skill supports from organizations like Covenant House. And so I lift them up because I recognize how much of their work, even though we don't often think of it in this space, how much of their work serves that particular community, and how much of, especially the life skills stuff, is the same kinds of wraparound services and supports that we're talking about that serve young people who are either at risk or are touching these systems of juvenile justice and or child welfare.
Great.
And if I could just add, there are two organizations I know in New York that are doing phenomenal work on the ground. It's the Hetrick Martin Institute. And the city has also come out with some resources called the NYC Unity Project. So if you look those two up, you'll find some more information. And especially with the Unity Project, that actually is led by the youth, LGBTQ identifying individuals. And so it's a great program that's being more rolled out and providing more resources for at the moment.
Great. I just want to add a question here around, we talk a lot about urban areas. What about these rural areas, right? How do we develop this continuum and ensure that young people are receiving services like YAP in rural areas across America? And curious what you all think about that, or how that work can get done, especially, and this is tied into a question here, where there's an increased tendency towards isolation now with COVID. So with all of these factors playing in, what does this look like for rural areas?
I know, at least in the philanthropic spaces that I've come into contact with, that there's a lot of great philanthropy that comes from individuals and organizations like the Walton Foundation that are doing a lot of good work within rural spaces particularly. And because the way that they're resourced has become highly individualized, and there's a kind of, almost rustic, rough kind of idea about what happens in rural areas, because they feel at times that there is a perception that they aren't part of like the general populace of the overall country. A lot of times it gets left out of the conversation, but they require resources from their elected officials and from the people that obviously are supposed to be held accountable to them as well. But I do see an increased role specifically in philanthropy for providing that work and for creating those organizations.
Great.
Yeah, I also think when we start talking about philanthropic infrastructure in those areas to support it, we're talking about community foundations by and large, because you don't find a lot of independent philanthropy in those areas. But we're also seeing the importance of state budgets and being careful as we talk about the allocation. In addition to the COVID-19 crisis that is of concern, in some of the states like ours, we just passed Medicaid expansion in our state. So where we find the challenges, we found rural hospitals were the first ones to be closed. And so we find gaps. So this is the importance, again, of the cultural organizing and narrative work, because what we find at the state level is we find cities and rural areas being pitted against one another for resources. We find that in our state, we find it in other areas, and we find cultural distinctions between the two. So I think we found promise in Black rural organizing collaboratives, the Black organizers primarily being based in cities, and then others, and then the rural folks being white, working poor folks who are finding themselves in rural areas. Those connections are critical to shaping a narrative that's good for all of us, using, as Reverend Barber talks about, fusion politics to begin to address those issues. And then I'll also say, as I wrap, we also have to be mindful of the lack of infrastructure in suburbs for supports. Part of what we find is that the social sector infrastructure has not kept up with the need. And so in as much as we have broken down silos of poverty with things like housing vouchers that allow people to move out of concentrated poverty in housing developments, what we've not done is made sure that the supports for people who have need have made it in the suburbs. And in some cases, we have some not in my backyard around that too. We don't want those services in our suburban areas. And so it's helpful for us to frame a narrative that is around all young people, that is across geographies, that is across race. And we do that through strong cultural and community organizing as well.
Great. So that's all the time we have for questions. I know there were some questions we didn't get to, but feel free to contact us, contact me. You can get that information from Youth First at nokidsinprison.org. There's still a lot of great questions, and we want to be able to hear from you all and to figure out ways to engage in this important work together. I'm going to pass it over to Darlene now. Thank you.
Mute.
Oh, it's always humbling, this technology. I was giving my gratitude and saying thank you. Before I say anything else, Shadow, is that what you all were handing out? Ah, got it. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. This has hopefully been not only informative, but also inspirational. I've got so many texts from people that are just saying they loved it, they're learning a lot, and these are folks that are out there on the ground doing it all the time, either in an academic institution, a community organization, and they're learning and relearning and beginning to continue to feel that they're not alone. I've just got 3 points to make. The first is that genuine social justice is healing justice. Our colleague Loretta Piles has a book by that same name. I would recommend that highly to all of you. But that's what we're talking about. Trey talked about caring, just simple caring, right? Trey, do you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Okay, go.
I didn't interrupt you or anything, but
That's all right.
what I wanted to say is that question about the LGBTQ, were they asking about like, do we have a program for them? Is that what they were asking? That's what they meant?
That's how I heard it, Trey. They were looking, the question came about particularly Black and Brown, LGBTQI questioning folks. Yeah, resources.
Just want everyone I want everyone to know that this community-based program is not just for Black and biracial kids. These programs are for anybody. You know what I'm saying? Like, it works for anyone. It's not just strictly for Black or biracial kids. If there's a kid that needs in need of help that's white, we're gonna give them help. You know what I'm saying? Just because they're not Black. You're saying everyone's gonna get help.
Yep. Thanks for making that point, Trey. Thanks a lot. The second point that I would make, building off of, as I was saying, what Trey said about simple caring, it's just, I get the tears, Trey, I get it, was not just what people and systems say, it's kind of what they do. And the Reverend pointed that out, talking about budgets and talking about budgets. Take a look at the money that's going into education. Take a look at the money that's going into housing, safe, warm, dry housing. Take a look at the money that's going into jobs for youth and other family supports. Take a look at the money that's going into social services and actually providing that type of care. So much, I was trying to take notes and trying to hold things in my head. The last point I would make in terms of what I heard was be relentless. Just be relentless. Shadow, I got stuck when you called yourself an elder, but that's just me, okay? They're elders and there are elders, but I hear you, brother, I hear you. As I said, I'm from Harlem, you're from Brooklyn, I got you, okay? I remember what Shirley Chisholm used to say, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair, okay? What we're talking about is set up your own table. Just set up your own table. Make it inclusive. Make it so that it's not just community-placed work that we're doing, but community-based work. That it's of, for, and with the people, with the credible messengers. You've got social workers out there that are ready. You've got faith leaders out there that are ready. You've got employers out there already. You've got for-profit people that are out there and ready. You've got programs galore that are ready that need to be given that green light to be resourced, okay, and emboldened to be able to act and to join us. As social justice warriors, we know we can't say it's a finite pool, okay? This is a pool that has to be inclusive, like-minded people getting together and moving forward. The final thing that I would say right now is this is just the first conversation. So if y'all thought that this was powerful, hold on, okay? October 22nd, we're going to be joined by Fania Davis. I know Reverend knows her and some other folks out there, my sister friend. She started an organization called RJOY, which is restorative justice for Oakland youth, and a whole bunch of other things she's done. Carmen, she's almost as busy as you are. And I would love to invite each and every one of you to please come on back and do the deep dive with us. There's a lot of work to be done. Thank you so very, very, very much for joining us today. Thank you.